Today we're going to be learning Beitzah Daf Lamed Vav. I'll remind everyone to register for the Siyum that will be on Sunday. Looking forward to seeing you all there. So it's a nice opportunity to see lots of people that I don't get to see on a daily basis, like the ones in the Zoom. So looking forward to seeing you there. We have a good program. You can look up all the details on our site, on Facebook, Instagram, whatever it might be. Okay, we're going to get started. We ended yesterday's daf with this discussion about the comparison between Meshilim Perot, right? We said you can take fruits down if the rain is coming and you want to protect your fruits, you can take them down through a chimney or a chute or some sort of window that's there. You cannot carry them in a box. We're going to see some other things you can't do today, but you can do it in that manner. You can't use ladders. We're going to see in some other things. Then they wanted to know, well, how many fruits are you allowed to take down? So then the Gemara said, well, let's learn it from, or possibly we could learn it from the Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat, which talked about taking out boxes from a storage house if you need the space for guests, for a Beit Midrash, to which the Gemara said, well, you can't necessarily compare for three possible reasons. So the first one we said was because maybe that was Bitul Beit Midrash, because you wanted, right, remember the always the greatest value in the Gemara is learning. So therefore, because of the importance of learning, we're going to permit it. Here, it's just a financial loss, right? Then we saw the opposite. Financial loss maybe is more than, right? Maybe you can actually, at first they wanted to say maybe Shabbat, you could do 4 or 5 because it'd be 2 Beit Midrash. Here, you don't even have that, even less. Then they said the opposite, which is, wait, but maybe here there's a financial loss. So we're going to allow you to do more than in the case where you're taking out stuff to make room for people. There's no financial loss. And then we brought the third claim, which is actually the second. I just went in the order that made more sense to me, the comparison of the two or the differences between the first one and the last one. They also mentioned, what about the fact that Shabbat is so stringent that we're not really worried that you're going to, if we allow you to do this, okay, you won't really say, you'll feel like it's not Shabbat. But on Yantif, when we're lenient about all sorts of other things, if we're lenient about this, we might cause people to disregard Yom Tov in other ways, and therefore maybe we're going to allow less. So again, the logic goes all ways. This is a good example, and the continuation of the Gemara as well, be a good example about how you could take the logic and switch it any which way you can, which obviously causes some confusion. As we're going to see, there's going to be a list of questions here. We're going to see a bunch of laws that were stated either about on Shabbat, about clearing out your storage house, or one stated about how you bring your fruits down, and on Yantif. And the question in each case is going to be, would it be the same for Shabbat, or if it was about Shabbat, would it be the same for Yantif? And they're going to bring both sides, and we're going to end with a teiku. We really don't know, because again, if we're going to use logic, the logic could go either way. In this case, hatam tnan. So we're starting from the top of our daf. There it says, okay, anytime they say hatam, it's going to be referring to their Shabbat. Anytime they say hacha means here, it's going to be about Yom Tov and our Sugyan Yom Tov. There it says in the Mishnah, after it says mefanim arba chamesh kupot, it says aval lo ata otzal, but you can't take the otzal. Okay, what is the otzar? Is the storage house. So what does that mean? Aren't we in the otzar? What are we talking about? Remember, we didn't understand this Mishnah then, just like we don't understand it now. And there we had Shmuel who explained it. V'amar Shmuel, my aval lo ata otzal. You can empty out 4 or 5 baskets or boxes worth, as long as you're not emptying out the entire, if that's the whole storage house and it's now going to be all floor exposed, that's going to be a problem. Why? Once you do that, you might see underneath that the floor is not straight, and you might start filling in the holes, and that's going to be a problem. If you remember, you're not allowed to sweep on Shabbat because of that. Again, their sweeping is not our sweeping. Our sweeping is on a hard floor, right? If you want to sweep in the dirt, that would be a problem, right? Their floors were made of dirt. So therefore, you can't do that. So the question is, hachaman, is it the same thing here? If you're going to take all the fruits off your roof and entirely, right, have an exposed roof, maybe you'll still have the same problem under the fruits. Maybe it wasn't solid ground, and maybe you'll want to fill in holes, etc. So do we say, now here come the two sides. Hatam hu b'shabbat asur mishum dechamil. Is it that Shabbat is forbidden because Shabbat is more strict? Here they're actually using this argument we used yesterday, but in the reverse. They're dafka saying because Shabbat is strict, we're going to be strict on this halacha. Aval Yom Tov dekil shaper dami. Maybe this isn't such an issue on Yantif. Worried that you might be ashvi yom. By the way, what the malacha involved? It's building. You're basically creating the floor ready to build on. You're flattening out the ground. Oh Dilma, or do we say hatam deika bitul beit midrash amart lo? There aval hacha deleka bitul beit midrash lo kol sheken. Or do we say there where we're worried the people won't be able to have a beit midrash just sit in and learn, and yet we still don't allow it, all the more so here when there's no bitul beit midrash happening, right? Again, that's a prime, right? A serious value to not have a beit midrash, and yet we don't allow it. So all the more so here when there's no bitul beit midrash involved, it has nothing to do with the beit midrash here that I'm taking my fruits off my roof. All the more so we're not going to allow it. So that's the debate. Next. Here's our second question. It says by us, okay, that was just the Mishnah. Rav Nachman says, Lo shanu ela ba'oto agag. They only allow you if you have this chimney or a window or whatever it is in your roof, and you want to lower the fruits through that. Aval migag legaglo, but if you don't, and you want to move it to your neighbor's roof, and from there put it down their chute, well, that's not going to work. Because why? Because that's more work. Now you're moving not only through this chute, but you're carrying it over to your neighbor's property, right? That's already a big deal. Not only did Rav Nachman say this, but there's a Beitzah where this appears explicitly. The Beitzah says, even if the height of our roofs, you can imagine, right? If the height's different, it's in height, so it would be more difficult to get it. Even if they're flush with each other and we're right next to each other and you're just passing it over, even that's not permitted. So here comes the question. Hatamai. Would you be allowed to move from one storage house to another storage house if you needed to, or somehow, or you wanted the space on the roof and you moved the stuff to a different roof? Would you be allowed to do that if you needed the space for a beit midrash or something? Right? It's not 100% clear what exactly the comparable case is. But again, do they say like this? We're going to see the two sides. Here we don't want to allow you to move from one roof to another because, again, Yantif, this is back to yesterday, Yantif is more lenient, and therefore we're more worried that if we permit certain things, people will disregard all sorts of other things on Yom Tov. But Shabbat is so strict. Everyone's going to know we're permitting this because it's a special heter, but no one's going to start doing other melachot on Shabbat because people take Shabbat very seriously. Shapir dami. So then we would allow it. Oh, Dilma, or do we say mahachadika hefse perot amart lo? Just like we said last time, because it's this bitul beit midrash is so important, and yet we don't allow it. Of course, we're not going to allow it in the other case. Here they take the other logic. They say the other argument here because of financial loss. All the more so you would think we would permit it, and yet we don't. So all the more so when there's no financial loss, when you're just trying to create space for some people. So all the more so, right, we're going to say lo kol shekain, that we're not going to permit it. Okay, third question. Hacha. Here it says, again, here on Yom Tov, lo yishal shalem b'chevel b'chalonot v'lo yoridem derech sulamot. You can't lower it through a rope going through the window or through using ladders. Okay, other ways you're not allowed to take the fruits down. So hatamai, can you use this method on Shabbat? Let's say you needed space that was higher up and you want to lower things down on a rope or through ladders. Do you say hacha b'yom tov hu da'asul deleka bitul beit hamidrash aval Shabbat ika bitul beit hamidrash shapir dami? Here they use the claim that on Yantif it's aser, right? They keep playing around with different lines of argument. Because they could have said Yom Tov is kal, and yet we don't allow it, right? But in the end, we say we're giving this answer. There's no bitul beit midrash, and that's why we don't allow it. But Shabbat, since it's going to prevent people from learning Torah, maybe we will permit it. Or are we going to say here there's a financial loss, just like we said in the last case, and yet we don't permit it? So all the more so, if there's no financial loss, of course we're not going to permit it. And the answer. Teku. We don't really know the answer to these questions. These are just different ways of looking at it, but we were only told the law in one or the other, and we don't know if it would apply to the other case. going back to the Mishnah, we're now going to get into a big machloka between Ula and Rabbi Yitzchak, and we're going to bring two proofs for Rabbi Yitzchak, and then I'm going to count how many proofs for, where's my sheet? Anyway, there's going to be, I lost my sheet, but here. There's going to be 4 attempted proofs for Ula. Okay, so first we're going to bring 2 attempted proofs for Rabbi Yitzchak, then 4 attempted proofs for Ula. Each time we're going to show that the sources they're bringing to strengthen each case, each side can actually be explained according to the other side as well, and therefore don't provide proofs. That's going to be the majority of our daf today, this section. So the Mishnah had said, Mechasin et ha'perot. You can cover the fruits, meaning if you have fruits that are going to get ruined, you can cover them with a utensil, okay, instead of bringing them down through your chimney. So Amar Ula, Va'afilu aveira delivne. He says, even piles of stones that you're used, right? Normally we have piles of stones that are used for building. We're going to talk about this soon, whether they're used for building or not. But even piles of bricks, you can cover with a utensil. Meaning it did say fruits in the Mishnah. It doesn't just mean fruits. It means really anything that's going to get ruined, you're allowed to cover with a kli. But Rabbi Yitzchak Amar, no way, no how. Not only am I not going to allow bricks, but I'm also only going to allow perot ha'reuyim, only fruits. Until now, we thought your fruits are drying on your roof. Remember, we talked about the fruits are not dry until a certain point, and when they're not dry, they're not actually ready for use. He says it's only if they're ready. If they're not ready, you're not allowed to touch them. Why? And as you can't bring them down, you can't cover them. Okay. The truth is, he wasn't talking about bringing them down, but he's talking here about covering them. Not clear what he would say about bringing them down. He says, you would assume he would probably think not. Only perot ha'reuyim va'az de Rabbi Yitzchak l'tamei. He goes according to he's consistent within his approach elsewhere. Because he holds, Damar Rabbi Yitzchak, ein kli nital ela ledavar hanital b'Shabbat. I can only carry a utensil, according to Rabbi Yitzchak, for the purpose of something that's not muktzah, that's something that's usable on Shabbat. If I can't use these fruits on Shabbat or Yantif, I'm not allowed to carry a vessel in order to cover them. Let's say I have a bowl, and I'm carrying the bowl to serve something that can't be moved on Yantif. I can't do it. Okay, if I want to cover something, it's muktzah. I have a Beitzah shenolda. Can I cover that Beitzah? No, because the Beitzah shenolda is muktzah. So I can't bring a kli to cover it. We've actually learned this before. So that's Rabbi Yitzchak's opinion. And therefore he says, of course you can't cover any produce that's not ready for use. Okay, that's muktzah. So that's him. So they're very extreme opinions, because Rabbi Yitzchak isn't only saying it's the truth is, we'll clarify later. It seems like he doesn't actually think it has to be perot specifically. It could be something that's not fruits, okay? That's not food, let's say. Okay, fruits is just produce. It could be something that's not food, but it has to be ready for use. That's his main thing. And Ula seems to not be bothered if they're not ready for use. So now they say, Tnan, let's try to bring a proof for Rabbi Yitzchak. It says in our Mishnah, Mechasin et ha'perot b'kelim, which sounds like perot in avera delivne lo. Right? It doesn't say bricks, it says fruits. That sounds like produce only. And produce, let's assume it means it's ready for use. So they say, no, huadin afilu avera delivne. It could still be bricks. We could explain it like Ula. Why did it say perot then? Well, that's because the Mishnah started with perot. I did tani reisha meshilim perot, which was the example that was relevant to bring down from your roof. So therefore, Tana Sefer Nami, Mechasin et ha'perot, they continue with the same subject, but really it's all one and the same. You could use also the other. Next. So the second attempt to prove Rabbi Yitzchak from the sources is the continuation of our Mishnah. Kadei yayin, tnan, v'chein kadei yayin, v'chein kadei shemen. You could also cover with a utensil jugs of oil and wine. The assumption is the jugs are open. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to cover them. So, and jugs of wine and jugs of oil are obviously ready for use. Well, maybe not so obviously, but you would think seem to be ready for use because there's oil in them, there's wine in them. Why would they be ready for use? So that would prove, again, Rabbi Yitzchak, that it has to be ready for use. But the Gemara says, you could say it could be jugs of wine and oil, but they hadn't taken the Trumot HaMaschal yet, which means we've already learned that they're not ready. Now, it's a little bit strange here because We said that tevel is actually mukhan. I'm going to leave that aside right here. They seem to be saying it's muktzah. Hachinami mistabra, and also one could assume that it must be talking about tevel because isal kadata kadei yayin v'kadei shemen dehetera. If you're saying it's something that was permitted, in other words, something that's ready for use, hatana leresha peirot, then you wouldn't need an additional case. It must be this is coming to add, even if you didn't take the trumuna masro, you could still cover them with a utensil. In which case, can't prove Rabbi Yitzchak from here because that's not Rabbi Yitzchak. It's not things that are ru'uyim. So now they say, no, you could explain like this. Even if you want to say it like Rabbi Yitzchak, you could still explain that what was the unique aspect of this that needed to be mentioned by itself. You could say, kadei yayin and kadei shemen, how ruined are they going to get? What's going to get more ruined? Your fruits on your roof or jugs with oil and wine? Likely your fruits because they're totally exposed. Whereas your jugs, there's water inside, but there's wine and oil inside. How much water is going to get into the opening of the jug? Not so much. It's a small loss. You might have thought maybe they don't permit it, but in fact they do. Okay. So that was our second attempt to prove Rabbi Yitzchak. And we said we could read this source as if it's tevel, in which case you could read it like ula as well. Okay, next source. Tanan. In our Mishnah also, it says, Notnim kli tachat hadelef b'Shabbat. You can put a kli underneath water dripping from your roof, from the gutter in your roof. Now, normally the water that drips from the gutter in your roof is bad water, and yet you can collect it in a utensil. Now, that means when I bring the utensil in order to collect the water, I'm carrying a utensil for something that's muktzah. So that would seem to prove ula. You could even use it to cover bricks, right? Things that are not ready for use on Shabbat. So what do they say? B'delef hara'oi. You could explain that maybe it's clean water and it would only work to move it for the purposes of clean water. That's how Rabbi Yitzchak could read our Mishnah. Next attempt to disprove Rabbi Yitzchak and prove ula. Tashma, let's learn from this source. Until now, we've been quoting from our Mishnah. Now we're going to quote other sources. Porsin machzelet al gabe avanim b'Shabbat. You can put a machzelet, a cover, like a mat, on top of rocks on Shabbat. Now, rocks are always the most muktzah that exists. So here you see, to cover the rocks, you're allowed to use it. So that goes against Rabbi Yitzchak. So the Gemara says, no, avanim mikor zalot, techazi on the beit hakisei. You could say these were special rocks that were specially designed to use in the bathroom. If you remember, we've seen this before, they would wipe themselves with rocks. There's at least three opinions. What is mikor zalot? Some people say they're sharp or jagged. It's a little bit of a weird explanation to me to think that they would use those in the bathroom. Some people say that's Rashi. Tosfot says they're softer, they're rakot. Some people say they're rounded out. Okay, so rounded out stones, which would make a little more sense. In any case, it's a little hard to understand in general how they use rocks to wipe themselves. You can use your imagination, I guess. Tashma. So in the end, we said it doesn't necessarily mean that they're muktzah. Next case. Tashma porsin machzelet al gabe kaveret borim b'Shabbat. This case we're gonna be dealing with for a while right now. So you can throw a machzelet on top of a beehive. You can read Flashback this week. Shuli Mishkan wrote about bees and beehives. So now you can throw this machzelet on a beehive. B'chama mipnei hachama, in the summer. I'll translate like this, right? In the heat because of the sun, and b'gshamim mipnei hagshamim, in the rain because of the rains. U'bilvad shelo yitkaven latzud. Okay, as long as you're not intending to trap the bees by throwing this machzelet on top. We're going to get back to that whole thing. Sounds like a davar she'eino mitkaven, right? I'm trying to cover it just to protect it. In the end, I might be trapping it, right? We'll talk about that later. So what's the issue here? A beehive, right? So we're assuming it's not necessarily ready, certainly not all year round. And this seems to say you could do it in the summer, you could do it in the winter, right? In the rainy season, remember in those where they lived, right? It's like in Israel more that there's a rainy season, that's the winter, and there's a summer season, right? No rain, that's the chama. So what do they answer? Oh, hatamnami dikadvash. It's not just a beehive. There's honey in the beehive. And honey is not muktzah, therefore you can cover it. So the Gemara asks, wait a minute, right? Again, this is to prove it could be Rabbi Yitzchak where it's Peirot HaRu'uyim, where you're covering it for something that's not muktzah. So they say, but wait. Amar leBarav Ukma Mimeshan leRav Ashi. He said to Rav Ashi, Hatinach b'yimot HaChamad yikadvash. I understand the summer months, there's honey there. Aval b'yimot HaShamim ma'ika lemeimar. But in the winter, there's no honey there, right? This is a seasonal thing. No honey in the winter. So how could you explain it said in the winter? So, okay, remember this question because we're going to give a totally different answer at the end. The question is, doesn't it say summer, winter? So how can you explain it? So what do they answer? The first answer is, Lo nitzcha ela lo tan shte chalot. You leave 2 honeycombs in the hive at all times so that the bees have what to eat. So those 2 hives are not muktzah because they're ru'uyim to eat, right? You can eat them. To which they say, wait a minute. You want to say that that makes it not muktzah? Otan shte chalot muktzah. Those are muktzah. What do you mean? They're meant for the bees. That doesn't mean they're not meant for us. That would make it muktzah. Right? I wouldn't eat from the beehive, the honey that was left for the bees. That's for them, not for me. So what do they answer? No, you'd have to explain that source was talking about a case where you thought about it before Shabbat or Yantif, and you said, I plan to eat from that honey on this day. Okay? So that's like already what we call an ukimta, right? That the Mishnah is talking about a very specific case where you had in mind already. That's the way we can, and this is all to explain that source according to Rabbi Yitzchak. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute, you think it's a specific case, right? Avalochi shev alehem, my asul. You want to say if you didn't have that thought before that I plan to eat from this honey, then it's going to be forbidden. If so, aditane ubevad shelo yitkaven latzud, the Beitzah already stipulated as long as you didn't intend to capture the bees. Once it's already stipulating there's conditions to this mission, it only works in certain circumstances, then liflag v'lidnei bedida, then you should have differentiated within it as well this issue about if the mission didn't stipulate anything, so fine, we could say maybe it was talking about a particular case. But if it already said, well, don't intend to trap it, then you should have also said, and make sure to think about it before that you plan to eat the honey. Otherwise, it won't work. So they say, no, you could explain it otherwise. And this doesn't, at least I had trouble fully understanding how this really answers the question. Once it's stipulated, why didn't it stipulate everything? But hachi ka'amal, this is the way you should read it. With the way I understand this is what they're saying is when it said, as long as you don't intend to capture, what it means is, as it really includes both, even though it didn't say that. As long as you intended to eat the honey, as long as you didn't try to trap the bees, it's okay. It doesn't really say that, so it's hard to explain it this way, but that's what they're saying. So, b'mayu kimta. So now we have a separate question. This is all, if we want to explain this according to Rabbi Yitzchak, what are we saying? We're saying that you had intent before, and that's why it's not muktzah. Otherwise, it would be muktzah, right? Because you have no intent to eat this honey. That would create a muktzah situation because it's only ra'oi for the bees. Now, remember whose opinion is that? Remember, Rabbi Shimon says if you have something that's animal fodder, right, your animals can eat it, then it's not muktzah. He has a very lenient definition of muktzah. So this must be Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. So b'mayu kimta ki Rabbi Yehuda d'ilei muktzah, who holds that something like this that's not meant for humans to consume would be muktzah. And only if you thought about it, right, that I plan to eat this, it won't be muktzah. If you're going to say that this source, again, this is all to explain that source, that it doesn't contradict Rabbi Yitzchak's approach, right? We want to have it that things are ra'oi to eat here, right? That's what we're talking about. So, and otherwise you wouldn't be able to put the machzelet on. That was Rabbi Yitzchak. So you'd have to say then, this Beitzah is Rabbi Yehuda, d'ilei muktzah. Well, if that's the case, ema seifa, it doesn't really match Rabbi Yehuda because in the davar she'eino mitkaven issue, remember Rabbi Yehuda, that they have 2 very big machlokot. If you talk about right Shabbat, these are the 2 main machlokot between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. Muktzah, right? Rabbi Shimon has the lenient definition, and davar she'eino mitkaven. If you don't have intent, right? There's a few more, all sorts of others, but these are the 2 real main ones. And he says davar she'eino mitkaven is mutter according to Rabbi Shimon, but is aser according to Rabbi Yehuda. So he says, right? So if you're going to say It's only Rabbi Shimon is going to allow you to put this machatzelet over, when in the end you're trapping the dvorim, right? He says as long as you don't have intent to capture, the whole issue of intent is only an issue. According to Rabbi Shimon, it'll help you. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it won't help you at all. So why is it there? So the Gemara counters this with a question and says, wait a minute, this doesn't match Rabbi Shimon either, because to Rabbi Shimon, you think this is Rabbi Shimon as long as you don't intend to capture the bees. What's the problem? If you put a machzelet, right, you put over this mat on top of the beehive, you're definitely catching them. And what did we learn about Rabbi Shimon? Abaye v'Rava, both Abaye and Rava, they both agree. He agrees when it's a case where it's definitely going to happen that you can't do it. So how could even Rabbi Shimon permit this? This bilvat shalei kaven latsu doesn't make sense according to either opinion. So what do they answer? La'olam kula Rabbi Yehuda. Really, this is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. It must be that there's windows or openings. It's not a machzelet, a mat that's totally solid and the bees can't get out. It has some holes in it where the bees could fly through. So the lo tema le Rabbi Yehuda ubavad shalei kaven latsu, then you have to change the wording. You can't say it really means as long as you don't have intent to capture. What it means is ela ema ubavad shelo ya'asena mitzuda. You can't make it a trap, meaning make sure there's openings that the bees can get out. So now we've explained it in a way that, again, this was all to explain the Amorag Shamim. It had to be, again, if you want to explain like Rabbi Yitzchak, that this beehive was a case where you can cover it only if it's not muktzah what's inside, right? It's ra'oi for you to eat. So what would be ra'oi? There's honey in it. Well, what about the winter? There's no honey in the winter. We can resolve that because we could say you always leave some honey in it for the bees to eat. And this week you thought, I plan to eat this myself. And then it would be perot haruyin and it would fit with Rabbi Yitzchak. So then the question becomes, if that's the case, it's obviously muktzah like Rabbi Yehuda, and yet the davar she'eino mitkaven part doesn't match him. Oh, it's not a davar she'eino mitkaven. It's just that you're covering it with a mat that has some holes. That's what he's trying to say in that line. So then the Gemara says, wait, that whole part is pshita. Obviously, you have to cover it with something that has holes, right? Otherwise, you'd be trapping. So why does he even need to tell you that? It would be quite obvious. So they say, and this is a really interesting as we say, a hypothesis, a suggestion. Ma'u detema, you might have thought, b'mino nitzod asur, shelo b'mino nitzod mutar. Maybe only when you talk about the malacha of tzeidah, of capturing, maybe trapping, you're only talking about types of animals that are normally trapped. People don't normally trap bees. Maybe that's not part of tzeidah. So that's why he needed to tell you, as long as you make it in a way that you're not trapping them, because you might have thought, since people don't normally, right? What do people trap? Animals, right? That they're going to eat. Nobody eats bumblebees, right? So they're not going to try to trap them. So therefore, you might have thought, since normally bumblebees aren't trapped, maybe it's not forbidden to trap them. Kamash Malan, that's why the Beitzah needed to tell you, to tell you that Seidah is relevant to bees as well. That was all to explain this question. Didn't it say winter? And winter, the honey's not ready. And that was all to explain Rabbi Yitzchak, that it had to be something was ready. And we explained it in some way that you leave these two chalot vash and someone has intent about it. Rav Ashi now comes with a different answer. Rav Ashi Amal, he looks at the wording of the Beitzah and he says, wait a minute, your whole question is off base because it doesn't say there summer, winter, okay, which in their words, right, you might have said kayetz cholef in Hebrew, but it also is called all the time in Tanaitic materials, Yemot HaGshamim, Yemot HaChama, the days of the rains, the days of the sun. Okay, that's not what it said. Look at the Beitzah again. It said, B'chama mipnei hachama, in the sun because of the sun, and b'gshamim mipnei ha'gshamim, in the rains because of the rain. Now it's true, rain comes in the rainy season and sun comes in the summer season, but he says like this: B'chama mipnei hachama, b'gshamim mipnei ha'gshamim katani. Look at the wording. You can explain that to mean b'yomei Nisan u'b'yomei Tishrei. exactly what we're in, right? New months. We're starting today, right? We're starting tomorrow. We're Rosh Chodesh today. So you might say, B'yomi Nisanu b'yomi Tishrei. Maybe what it's referring to is days like this in Israel anyway, right? Again, in different places in the world, it might rain at all times, but in Israel, it's rain season and not rain season. But what about the in-between seasons around Pesach and around Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, right? Tishrei month. D'ika chama v'ika kshamim. There's sun and there's rain. And maybe what it means is, right, and ika dvash. And in those seasons, the in-between, there is still honey because it's the in-between season. It wasn't talking deep into the winter. It was talking in the transition between the seasons. If you want to cover it because of the rain, because it might start to rain then, like it did on Sukkot this year, right? Then you can cover it. But there's still honey in there. And then you don't need that whole line of reasoning that we said, oh, you thought about it. And if you thought about it, then why didn't it say so in the source and blah, 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 blah. You can answer it in a much simpler manner. Moving on in the Mishnah. So that ends our section we started with this. You could put a kli on top of the fruits. Does it mean just fruits that are ready to be eaten according to Rabbi Yitzchak, or anything that's ready that's not muktzah? Or could it even be bricks and things like that really you don't need on Yantif, but you're allowed to cover them as well? That's Ula. We brought, again, two sources to try to prove Rabbi Yitzchak. However, we explained them according to Ula, and then which were both from our Mishnah. And then we brought four sources to try to prove Ula against Rabbi Yitzchak, and we explained those as well. Continuing on in the Mishnah, you can put a utensil under a leak from your roof or something like that, your gutter dripping on Shabbat. Tana, the Beitzah says, okay, this is going to be more detail about this case. If the kli fills up with water, you can keep dumping it and put it back and keep dumping it and put it back, even though that ends up a lot of work. You can be doing this all day long. No problem. You can do this. Now we're going to have a story. I'm already going to tell you that it's a little bit difficult to understand the story. There's different parshaniyot. Each one has some weaknesses. Try to explain in one way, maybe kind of mention the other way as well. He had a millstone, which was dluf. There was a leak. Okay. There was water dripping near it. Now, Rashi says what happened. Well, it was standing on, it was like in the dirt, and the dirt was getting moist. And he was worried that the ground was going to kind of, open up a little bit, and the millstone was going to fall inside and break. Okay. Like they would get a hole in the ground. Like there was a building in Ranana that just the other day they were building, and there was an air pocket, and, all of a sudden the whole building started to collapsing because, right, as soon as the ground is no longer solid, then everything starts to fall. So this happened. He goes to Rabbah to ask him what to do. Remember their relationship. Abai was adopted by Rabbah. So he goes to, and Rabbah was his rabbi as well. He goes to him and he says, what do I do? Amar le, zil aile lepurayich lahatam. Go take your bed outside to where it is. This will be like a graf shari. What's this? This is a utensil that was used to take out, right, where they would put their excrement, okay? When they would go to the bathroom, they would put it in a utensil, and then they would dump it from there. Now, if you have a utensil filled with excrement, you're allowed to move it because it's disgusting, right? It's muksa because it has no use, but it's also disgusting. So now what's disgusting here? It's a little bit, this is what's tricky. What exactly is the graf shali? So some people say, if you had a kli there that was filling up with water, or the truth is, I think it's talking about the water that was collected that's there will become like a graf shali, and then you can move it. Or maybe the rechayim, the millstone, will become disgusting because it's full of mud and dirt, and he can then remove it because it's bothering him. In other words, here's an interesting situation. Usually it's that the graf shali happens to be in front of you. We allow you to move it out of your way. He's telling him, create a situation where this becomes disgusting to you because you're sitting there and trying to sleep next to something disgusting. And then that permits you to move it. So what we're moving exactly is unclear. Are we moving the millstone, or are we moving a bucket full of water that's there, or the water that collected there, or something like that? Maybe unclear exactly what it is. Yativ Abaye v'kakashile. So Abaye, here's what Rabbah says, but he's not so convinced. He says, but wait, we know there's a law that you can't create a graf shali'i to be allowed. You can't create, okay, now here it's not exactly creating a graf shavui, but if it happens to be there and it's bothering you, you can move it. But you can't say, I'm going to move my bed outside so that I'm bothered by what's going on here and I can then move it. So he didn't really like Rabba's solution. So in the meantime, he was pondering what to do. And Adahachi, in the meanwhile, Nafal Beirechaya Abaye. His millstone falls, breaks, end of story. Not really end of story. And the last line is kind of the most important line. Or maybe you could say, Amar, he says, Titili da avre adimal. He says, in Hebrew, we say, Magiali, okay? I deserve what happened because I didn't listen to what Rabba told me. Okay, I should have listened, and therefore I got punished. Why is this such an interesting line? Because it's really a question whether one can do this. Can you make statements of this sort, like, oh, this happened because of that, right? There's a whole debate among rabbis in general, or whether this is a permitted action. It almost is like nichush. Nichush is a little different. Nichush in the Torah is you say, if this falls there, then I'll do this, right? It's kind of causing you to do something in the future. This is going backwards and saying, this happened because of that. And we know there's rabbis who go around and say, oh yeah, this accident happened because people were Mechalel Shabbat or things like that, right? But there's a debate about whether one is even allowed to do such a thing. So it's an interesting line that Abai says it, right? Again, it's a matter of also how serious was he? Was he kind of saying it in a joking manner, like, oh, I deserve what I should have. How serious he meant it is a good question. I mean, the Gemara did manage to quote it to us, but this is a debatable statement, whether it's really okay to say such a thing like this or not. Okay. Amar Shmuel. Shmuel says, if we're already on the topic of graf shel re'i, that's a kli where they would put the urine in. Mutar lo tzian lashpan, that is the graf shel re'i, and the avit where they put the urine in. Mutar lo tzian lashpa. You can dump them in the garbage. Okay. Thankfully, we're not so used to this kind of thing. I mean, people do have bedpans and things like that sometimes. So you're allowed to empty them out, even though theoretically they're muktzah, but you can empty them out. The problem becomes when you want to bring it back in. Now, the ashpa was outside, so you want to bring it back inside. I assume we're talking about where there's no carrying issue here, right? We're talking about just from the muktzah perspective. Let's say there's an eruv where it depends where your garbage is. But the question is, can you bring it back inside? Kashumach zero, you're basically carrying a utensil that had disgusting things in it. It's not really usable for anything. So what do they say? No tembo mayim umachziro. You can fill it up with water and then you're bringing it in because of the water, even though the water is disgusting as well. But maybe you could use the water for some, not for drinking, obviously, but maybe you'd use it for something else. Savor mine. So now they assumed graf shari'i agav manein b'fnei atzmo lo. A graf is a utensil, and so is the avit is a utensil. So they assume maybe these can only be carried in a utensil, but you can't carry them by hand. Now, obviously, urine you're not going to carry by hand. There's no way to do that. But maybe the excrement you could theoretically carry by hand. So they say tashma, but then they learn from here dahu achbarta. There was a mouse. The ishikach be isparmake to Rav Ashi. He was in the house of perfumes that he had, and they found a mouse there. Amar lehu Rav Ashi nakte betzutzita va'afkua. Rav Ashi told his people, go take it by its tail and take it out, which means, right, the assumption is that that's equivalent to this re'i, this disgusting thing. And he took it by the tail and he took it out, which shows that you don't have to put it in a utensil. You can actually carry it directly. Okay, I don't know that you want to, depending on what it is, but here you have this image of, them taking out this mouse by hand. Okay, Mishnah. Okay, now we're moving on to something totally different. And there's a whole question about why things are categorized in this way and what the significance is. You can look at commentaries if you want. I'm not going to focus on it, but they bring three different categories. And then the Mishnah is going to bring three examples of each of the three different categories. Those are the three categories. We'll talk about them in a minute. If things fall into these three categories and they're forbidden on Shabbat, they're going to be forbidden on Yom Tov as well. Shvut is usually something that's forbidden by the rabbinic law, where the rabbi said, we need to make a gzerah here and forbid something. And some people explain, based on the continuation of the Mishnah, we're talking about something where there's no mitzvah involved in doing the action. It's an action that's purely something the rabbis forbade. Mishum reshut is there's somewhat of a mitzvah involved, and yet it's forbidden in any case. okay, which we're going to see what that is. And mishum mitzvah is, there's a mitzvah involved, okay? There's certain things that are mitzvot to do, but yet they're forbidden on Shabbos. And all those things that fall into these categories that are forbidden on Shabbos are also going to be forbidden on Yantiv as well. So now it's a little bit hard to understand what this means till we get to the examples. These are things that are forbidden by rabbinic law. Lo olim bi'ilan, you can't climb up a tree. Velo rochvim al gabei behema, you can't ride an animal. The Gemara is going to get to all these things why you can't do them. Velo shatin al pnei hamayim, and you can't swim in the water. Velo mitapchim, you can't clap. Remember, that's how we explained it. There's some different explanations, but we'll go by what we said the other day. Velo misapkim, which Rashi says is to clap with your hands on your legs. Velo merakdin, and you can't dance. So these are all things that are forbidden by rabbinic law. There's not necessarily any sort of mitzvah associated with doing any of these things. Lo danim, you can't judge in a court. Lo mikadshim, you can't betroth a woman. Velo choltz, right, which is the first stage of marriage. Velo choltzim, velo miyavmim, you can't do chalitza or yibum. So I assume these examples are not comprehensive. I see your question, Adina. I assume they're not. They're just giving you examples. You can't do yibum or chalitza. Yibum is where if your husband dies before you have any children, you're supposed to marry the brother. That would be yibum. Chalitza is if the brother doesn't want to marry you, then you do the whole ceremony of chalitza. We'll get into all that. We're heading towards Seder Nashim soon. We'll learn that all more in depth. Okay, so all those things are reshut. They're not exactly a mitzvah, although the Gemara is going to say, what do you mean? They're not a mitzvah. Aren't they a mitzvah? We'll get to that. But they're called reshut here. And yet you can't do them on Yantif or Shabbat. Ve'elu mishum mitzvah, lo makdishim. Don't confuse this with mikadshim. Makdishim is lahakdish, to say, I'm sanctifying this item to the temple. As is ma'arichim and machrimim. These are all different ways of sanctifying items to the temple. Cherem usually goes to the Kohen. Erchin is when you say, I'm giving the value of a person to the Beit HaMikdash. You can't do that on Shabbat, even though it's a mitzvah. Ve'lo magbihin, and you can't take trumot and maaschot. These were all said about Yom Tov, all the more so Shabbat. This is a little strange. The Mishnah started off, all these, if they're forbidden on Shabbat, they're also forbidden on Yom Tov. And this, now it says, right, these are all by Yom Tov, all the more so on Shabbat. Then the Mishnah says, Ein ben Yom Tov l'Shabbat, ela ochel nefesh b'lvad, even though we know there are some other differences, but this is like a kind of blanket statement. That's the big main difference between Shabbat and Yom Tov, ochel nefesh. So now the Gemara goes into detail. Lo olim bi'ilan, what's the reason? Because you might pull off a branch, which is forbidden, right? That's kotzel. If you're riding on an animal, you might not pay attention to how far you're going, right? If you're walking, you'll be more conscious. You might leave the tchum. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. Could that really be it? All right, but then, shmamina tchumin deoraita. There's a big machloket. Is tchumin deoraita or derabbanan? If you say it's gzera derabbanan, that you might leave the tchum, it must mean the tchum is deoraita. And we know there's a machloket about it, so it would seem strange. So they say, we're worried you might cut something in order to lead the animal. That's why you can't ride in an animal. You might build a raft because you might see it's hard to swim. So you might build a raft, right? Question, obviously, nowadays we don't build rafts, right? So why is it still usher? So there's other issues that are involved with swimming. It's different customs, people who do swim, people who don't swim. But there's other issues like squeezing your hair and some other issues as well. Anyway, and also, are we allowed to say, oh, this doesn't apply anymore because we don't build rafts, right? That's another question, whether you can even say that. So anyway, that's an aside. Next, so we already saw this, and there we saw, that's why the Shayat is a question, because there we saw the Tosfot at least said, not everybody says it, but Tosfot said, this isn't relevant nowadays because we don't know how to make clay shear anyway. Not everyone agrees with that. Then you would not even have a question on the previous one. Lo danim, what do you mean? It's a mitzvah to be a judge in a court. So they say, if you're like a lowly judge and there's someone who's a higher judge, a better judge than you, so for you to do it is not as much of a mitzvah because there's someone better than you, and yet, right, you want to do it. So that's lo danim. Therefore, it's in the category of reshut because it's really reshut for you to judge because really someone else should take precedence. Last thing for today, v'lo mekadshim, you can't betroth the woman. Daf Mishalahem this week, Shiur and Chamutal, Rabbanit Shiur and Chamutal discuss specifically this issue, getting married on Shabbat. mitzvah kavi, but isn't it a mitzvah to betroth a woman? And then it should be in the mitzvah category. So they say, very interesting answer. It's a case where you already have a wife and you already have sons. If you already have a wife and you already have sons, it's not a mitzvah to take on another wife. So by the way, it's not necessarily saying it's a bad thing, although we will see when we get to Seder Nashim, seems from a bunch of sources, it was, even though they talk about you can marry more than one wife, it wasn't a very practiced thing. It's not always looked so highly upon. And here, certainly they're saying it's certainly not a mitzvah. Once you already have a wife and you already have children, it's not a mitzvah. And therefore that comes in the reshut category. It's more of an optional. It's a good thing to do maybe, but it's optional. And again, whether it's a good thing to do or not is a whole separate question. Obviously nowadays we don't do this anymore. Anyway, talking about Rabbanit Gershom, we don't do this, but not only most laws of most countries don't allow it as well, but in any case, it was practiced, by the way, in certain Temani in Yemen, it was practiced until not very long ago. The people did have more than one wife. So it was somewhat practiced. The question is whether it's good or not. That's a whole separate thing. With our modern eye, it's obviously clear what our answer would be to that question. And we will finish with that for today. Have a great day, everyone.